I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed's Sunday feature interview. I'll be back again tomorrow with another weekday episode of Fear and Greed, the normal mix of business news and interviews that sets you up for a successful day. In the meantime, enjoy our Sunday feature interview. At Fear and Greed, we call on business practitioners and experts for their perspective on events and their advice. Professor Gordon Menzies earned a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics at Oxford University in 2001 and is Associate Professor, Economics Discipline Group at the University of Technology, Sydney. He's won prizes for both his teaching on the impact of economic thinking in society and his research on belief changes in financial and currency markets. This year, he's published his first book, Western Fundamentalism. Professor Gordon Menzies, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Now, firstly, how are you and your students at the University of Technology in Sydney coping with the changes required by COVID-19 lockdowns?
COVID has certainly delivered the university sector the worst kind of uncertainty you can imagine. I mean, we're in Sydney, as you know, and who knows if next week Sydney will turn into Melbourne and be locked down, or if someone will discover a cure for COVID. So there's a mountain of administration that's come through because of that. And the university's been experimenting with a mixture of face-to-face teaching and online teaching. And many students have taken to online teaching, and I honour them for that. I personally prefer seeing people face-to-face. Our student satisfaction surveys have actually been surprisingly high. But of course, it doesn't suit everybody, and it's been difficult in all sorts of ways for everybody.
I read an article that you wrote in The Conversation a few months ago, and you said, "It is necessary to worry about health, but pessimism about the economy will hurt us." Then the article ended with a fantastic conclusion: "There's no point huddling together like economically frightened sheep. It blinds us to the good that's around us now and the good that's to come." Well, firstly, congratulations on putting those words together. I've been a journalist for many years, and I wish I could have come up with economically frightened sheep.
Thanks.
But explain what you mean by that.
Sure. Well, I think the best analogy I can give is the toilet paper crisis. So that's an example where there were two possible outcomes, or two settled outcomes. Economists call these equilibria. There were two possible outcomes, and it depended upon people's optimism. So if people believe there'll be enough toilet rolls at the supermarket, they don't panic and they only buy a few. Lo and behold, there are then enough toilet rolls in the supermarket. But if people get scared and panic buy, another equilibrium occurs where there aren't enough toilet rolls in the supermarket and everybody believes that their original beliefs were confirmed. Now, this danger of self-fulfilling prophecies is true partly in the economy too. So now people have to be wise and watch out for their interests, of course. But if that goes too far and becomes an obsession with pessimism, then a lack of spending by businesses or hiring or private people not spending can actually make the economy worse.
And so does it become self-fulfilling? It builds on itself when there is optimism or pessimism?
Yes, economically, if employers, for example, there's many examples here, but just one example, if employers are very, very reluctant to take staff back on when the economy begins to improve, those staff won't have the earning power from wages, which will in fact justify the employers taking them on in the first place, because employers will take on staff if they believe the economy will go well, but the act of actually taking on staff helps make that happen. And if they don't do it, it may well lead to low spending and justify the decision not to take the staff on. So it's very complicated, but it is self-fulfilling.
And these sorts of decisions are being made in very uncertain environments. In terms of your research and on belief changes, how do you think people process this type of information, particularly in the face of uncertainty, and COVID-19 being a great example of that?
Yes. So look, in general, people often take time to process information. I guess you've heard the saying, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Well, sometimes people receive a whole string of news, and then perhaps surprisingly, the last bit of news seems inconsequential, but it's enough to tip them over into a particular view, whether that's optimistic or pessimistic. That's why you can sometimes see a market reacting suddenly and violently on what looks like trivial information. I did my PhD in Oxford on the Asian financial crisis, and that happened in July 1997. Now, why it happened in July and not some other time is a bit of a mystery, but the evidence just built up, and then suddenly the straw broke the camel's back. But look, that's what's true generally, but I think there's something about this crisis I want to share with you, which is that there is one piece of information that's absolutely critical, and I can't think of another situation where an economy's been in a recession where one piece of information has this power. But of course, we know what that is. It's what would happen immediately if we were confronted with a cure for COVID or a vaccine. So that one piece of information would change the world so much. And I can't think of another situation except perhaps a war or something like that where the whole economy hinges so much on one bit of information. And that piece of information would be very powerful and visible. I don't think anyone would ignore that.
How much harder is it to make a decision in an uncertain environment than a certain environment? Is there some way you can measure that?
Yes, you can measure the volatility of an environment. If you've got things that you're relying on, you can measure what's called its variance, so the statistical measures for that. So you can sometimes try and hedge that risk away. You can buy options and things like that, which protect you if things go a certain way. But what is very difficult is if the whole economy is like that, and it's quite difficult to find things that you can hedge. I suppose, as I think about this, there have been some sectors of the economy, like some transport sectors or technology sectors, that have done rather well in the COVID times. And so I suppose people could be hedging their investments a bit that way too.
Now, we're surrounded by a wealth of data, many perspectives, and understand that there's always good news around us and there's always bad news around us. And at the moment, you see a lot more bad news, notwithstanding there is good news out there. What are you seeing as the good news for us at the moment? What are the sorts of news that we can focus on with somehow could break through the spiral of pessimism?
I'm glad you mentioned the bad news, because the first thing I'd say is don't listen to news too much. I mean, there are 195 countries in the world, and there are basically a dozen major stock exchanges. So there is always going to be some bad news about COVID available somewhere in the world and on some stock exchange. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about people in other countries or anything like that. I'm taking your question about trading to refer to how businesses should react.
Yep.
Not all news is relevant for businesses, and indeed not all news from overseas is relevant for Australia. Some is very relevant, some is not so relevant. So I guess my first thought is not to listen to the news too much. Look, I think there's been a number of things that have been what you might call good news about this crisis. I've been impressed at the social capital that Australia has. That's the kind of network of obligations and people's willingness to act for the social benefit. That phrase, we're all in this together, it's a bit of a cliche, but I have felt that in Australia. And there's been people putting that into practice with pay cuts or job sharing, or even the political support for government welfare, which, although it's frayed occasionally, it's actually been quite solid. So that's an impressive thing. I guess as an economist, we often talk about maximising GDP, and the question that comes to my mind is, what's all the GDP for if it isn't helping people out in a situation like this? Other good news, I guess there's been productivity improvements, which will lead to some things being done better. I know that lots of things I've avoided doing as a university lecturer to do with technology, I've had to come to terms with very quickly. Yeah. And I'm sure that there'll be many other people all across the economy who will, after this is over, gladly go back to the way things were for some things, but for other things, there'll be better ways of doing things. I think it's important that China has done relatively well. Right at the onset of this crisis, I always thought if China does relatively well compared to the rest of the world, then Australia will do relatively well compared to the rest of the world because of the close economic ties that Australia has with China. And we're linked to China through our commodities as well, and iron ore has been doing quite well as a commodity as China's recovered. And finally, you'll appreciate this because I know you used to work at the Reserve Bank. There are some enormous advantages in Australia having a floating exchange rate. If I can just quickly explain those. Every time the world goes into a crisis, commodity prices usually go down in a tailspin. And the thing is, Australia is one of the few exchange rates in the world that you can model reasonably well, and you can model it with its correlation with commodity prices. So here's the thing. Every time a big international crisis hits, commodity prices fall, and then Australia's dollar tends to fall as well. And that makes us competitive. That's what got us through the GFC without having a recession. And it won't save us from a recession this time, but it has helped us. So these are all things that are kind of in the background. They're not very newsworthy. You don't hear them that often, but they are positive and they are there.
Next time I'm thinking about the news and reading the news, I'm going to keep all those things in mind, Gordon.
Good.
Look, you've written a book called Western Fundamentalism. Firstly, congratulations on the book. It looks like a pretty remarkable exploration of philosophy and how that impacts democracy, thinking and debate. Now, there's a section, Economy, Welcome to a Shadow World, which critiques the reliance on greed in our economy and then the danger of unchecked markets. Greed is good was a Gordon Gekko saying in the late 80s. Is it still relevant today?
Oh, that's a great question, and it's my namesake, Gordon. Well, look, I think that what our economic system does is it tries to harness people's desire for being successful in businesses and so on to the public good. Now, a lot of the time that works quite well, but sometimes it doesn't work so well. And so I think a bald statement like greed is good is not really defensible. You'd have to unpack it. We do have a market economic system, and one of the things that I talk about in my book is how markets have their pluses and minuses. Now, any economist will tell you that there are disadvantages when markets don't factor certain things in. So economists have a technical term for it called externalities or unintended knock-on effects from certain transactions. And of course, the classic example of a knock-on effect in a market is pollution. You buy something, it's actually leading to some problem of pollution elsewhere. So economists have been aware of these kinds of weaknesses of markets for quite a while. But what's relatively new is some experimental evidence that when people deal in markets, it can change the way that they think, or it can even change their moral behavior. So there's a very famous example where there was a number of creches in Israel who were having problems with parents turning up late. So they decided to introduce a fine. They must have had an economist on staff. And when they introduced the fine, do you know this story? Do you know what happened?
No, I don't.
No, the number of people turning up late increased. And here's the explanation that the researchers offered. They said that before there was a fine in place, people regarded turning up late simply as bad moral behaviour, and they looked at it in that way. But once there was a monetary fine in place, it suddenly became a price of babysitting. And if I've got a high-flying job and my time is very valuable to me, then maybe I only have to pay $20 for turning up late to pick up my kid when I turn up late. Maybe it's worth my time just to stay at work a bit longer and pay for the babysitting. So the idea there is that financial incentives can have an effect on people and change their moral behaviour in a way. So that's a kind of interesting new stream of research that's come online. But one of the things I talk about in the book is how economic thinking has seeped into non-economic activities of life. People sometimes call this neoliberalism, but I'm thinking in particular of things like the sexual revolution. Some of the knock-on effects of the sexual revolution are experienced by children, and this kind of way that markets can change people's ethics and so on, you maybe can see that in courting practices now and the way men and women relate to each other. And there may be a kind of people being degraded into things like market transactions. So these are all the kinds of things that I really enjoy exploring in the book.
You certainly put an economist hat on when considering everyday activities, I suspect.
Yes. Yes, that's one of the things that economists like to do is they put that hat on as they look at all sorts of things in the world.
You also write that the 2020 outbreak of COVID-19 shook the foundations of many, and the compulsory lockdown provided time and opportunity for reflection. Crisis and uncertainty naturally give us pause. How do we use that pause for advantage?
Look, I think it depends on what kind of area you're talking about. I know that a lot of people have found the experience of lockdown very traumatic, people who live in difficult situations or in the extreme abusive or violent situations, or people who are just lonely and find themselves by themselves all the time. But I know that it has had other effects. I know that some people have really valued the extra time with a close circle of intimates that they live with, or a group of friends, and it's been a positive thing for them. In terms of what we can think about, well, I think we can think about all manner of things in life that we don't normally get the chance to think about. Maybe even the meaning of life. There's a whole range of things that we often get too busy to think about. I think that if I can put my hat back on as an economist, I suppose that two things that strike me about the experience of the last year is it might make people rethink two core ideas that we've pretty much accepted since the 1980s. So those ideas are the worthwhileness of small government and the emphasis on free trade. Now, I'm actually a bit of a fan of free trade. I think that it does allow countries that are best at producing things to get on with producing them and trade them with other people that aren't as good at producing them. So I'm a bit of a fan of free trade, but I do recognise, as a lot of other people do, that in situations like this, as in wartime, you wonder or you worry about the issue of self-sufficiency. You wonder whether if everybody's just producing what they're best at, but something happens and you get cut off from the rest of the world, what does that look like? I don't think that's a reason for everybody to stop trading with each other, but I think it might be a bit of a shift in emphasis in the way people think about the benefits of free trade. And the other thing is small government implies privatising things, putting out to contract, and there have been some horrible failures of that. So the Victorian quarantine situation might appear to a lot of people to be a failure of privatisation when you put something out to tender and do it quickly and all that kind of thing. So I think people will probably reflect a bit more on the advantages of government and the advantages of centralised decision-making as opposed to decentralised decision-making. I don't want to point my finger at any particular country, but I think that Australia's done remarkably well with I know we only have a small number of states, and it's probably easier to organise meetings and agreement among a small group of entities than a large group, but it's been quite amazing to see the benefits of government run well.
You've left us with plenty to ponder. Gordon, thanks for joining Fear and Greed this morning.
Thank you very much. Great to talk.
That was Professor Gordon Menzies, Associate Professor, Economics Discipline Group at the University of Technology, Sydney.